Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our 5th year of Aviation Reimagined webinar series, hosted by Griffith University. So this is the first webinar of our 3-part series, running Thursdays, 3 p.m. AEST in October. So this series builds upon previous years, and we'll put a link in the chat function for anyone who'd like to see speakers and content from last year. So Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and are located for this meeting today. So I'm here on our Nathan campus and as Yagara Turrbal people. We pay respects to elders past and present, extending that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So my name's Tim Ryley, Professor of Aviation here at Griffith University, and I'm facilitating today's session with Dr. Emma Whittlesea from Stralis. Today's session focuses on the economic, business and financial elements of moving towards a decarbonised aviation industry. The session covers business management, international regulation of environmental impacts, climate finance and investment, marketing and associated greenwashing, and the regulatory challenges for emerging new technologies. We'll have 3 presentations, and at the end there will be a Q&A session. So please post any questions for the speakers in the Q&A function as we go along. And if they are for a particular speaker, please note who it's for. A quick reminder that all sessions are recorded, and you can access the links to the recordings online. So firstly, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who's Tim Johnson, Director, Aviation Environment Federation, and Tim is joining us from the UK. In terms of his background, Tim Johnson is Director at Aviation Environment Federation, AEF, and a lead representative of the civil society participating in ICAO's environmental work. AEF is the principal UK NGO campaigning on aviation's impact for people and the environment and represents communities living around airports and under flight paths. Tim will present about the global and national environmental regulation for aviation. Thank you. Floor is yours, Tim.
Thanks very much, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone, or wherever you're joining us from. Morning for me. Yeah, as Tim just mentioned, I'm from an environmental NGO. I'm based in the UK. And I've been attending ICAO meetings, so the UN organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, for about 25 years now. It's a really important part of the work that we do. But I've been asked to sort of speak a little bit about the how global and national environmental regulation is driving or perhaps even hindering environmental protection, and in particular the climate challenges as we move forward. So this is what I'm going to run through today. I'm going to sort of just start off with not to go over what Tim just said by way of introduction, but there's a few things that I wanted to just to emphasize. So as I say, my organization, Aviation Environment Federation, we're based in London. We are a federation of community groups around the UK's airports, under flight paths, founded in the 70s. As you can imagine, those issues were probably very much dominated by noise and air pollution concerns through the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s. And we were sort of, I suppose, became very aware of the sort of climate debate at around that time in the 1990s. And there's been this transition, I think, in terms of our sort of policy outlook and our workload towards that climate change challenge, but noise and air pollution are always there in the background. And I should say that, you know, we get one seat at ICAO for all the environmental NGOs, and obviously AEF can't fulfill that role on its own. No environmental organization can, and so we go to ICAO meetings as part of a coalition. It's called the International Coalition for Sustainable Aviation. And so environmental NGOs, be it in sort of North America or international NGOs or Europeans, we're all part of this coalition, and we sort of actively participate under this single voice. So let's dive straight in. This building on the left is ICAO headquarters in Montreal. The ICAO 80 logo above it symbolizes the fact that it's 80th anniversary of ICAO since the founding Chicago Convention. And you know, during that time, it's done some things really well. So it sets the recommended standards and practices that define the noise limits, the emission limits that aircraft manufacturers have to meet, you know, and periodically there's a cycle of reevaluating those and working out where there's scope to tighten the stringency. And that has worked really well. But since the Kyoto Protocol in '97, there's also been a sort of an expectation that developed countries would pursue the limitation of greenhouse gases working through ICAO. And this has really sort of dragged in the sort of policy debate at the same time. And there's a real central tension here. In fact, there's two central tensions. The first is the vision that ICAO is a body that's set up to achieve the sustainable growth of an industry. And here we are talking about environmental regulation, which often feels like a constraint. And the second one is that 2.2 focuses on developed countries, and ICAO is really trying to promote a sort of harmonized approach that brings all countries together. And so you have this tension where some of the environmental politics and the climate change politics come in and are very much at the fore, where you have countries in parts of the world who are encouraging those with mature aviation industries to do something, and an industry and those countries saying, yeah, but we don't want to create competitive disadvantages, so we have to bring everyone at the same speed. And that really is a central tension that runs through it. Worth saying that ICAO is not a regulator. Its policies, its resolutions, they're not legally binding. That requires state enactment to make that happen. And so states have to legislate. You've probably all heard of CORSIA, which is ICAO's offsetting scheme. But that in itself is, if you like, is an architecture. It only has legal validity because states have to enact that in their own national laws. And some states do, and some states don't. So you get variable implementation. And of course, ICAO also only applies to international aviation. And this is an incredibly small graphic that you have on the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side. But the dark blue bars are international passengers. So you can see that in Africa, in Europe, and in the Middle East, international passengers dominate. But obviously in sort of Asia and in North America and in Latin and South America, it's very much dominated by domestic passengers. And ICAO is only really focused on international aviation. It has no jurisdiction over domestic. So it comes as a surprise to me, actually, that we don't talk about aviation more in the climate change conferences every year, because everything in pink, domestic passengers, the emissions from those domestic passengers, are in countries' national inventories. So when you go to the COP process each year and we talk about the Paris Agreement and its temperature goals, they're very much part of what states already have in their inventories. But it's very much the case that actually we don't have a lot of discussion there. Everything seems to go through ICAO. So if you look about how that works in practice and you take something like CORSIA, so this is, as I say, the offsetting scheme, there's a really huge amount of work that goes into the technical work that underpins this. So states and international organizations, industry and NGOs alike, they nominate experts. There's a 3-year work program, really focuses on the detail. So you get these quite complex, really robust framework agreements. So we've worked out how to do the whole sort of life cycle assessment of sustainable aviation fuels so that we can credit them under CORSIA. We have something called the CERT tool, which is probably the most definitive and powerful modeling tool for international aviation. A lot of airlines contribute data each year. It's sort of anonymized, but it means that we're actually able to have real actual data that can estimate and validate some of the results. We've got strong monitoring and reporting and verification requirements, and I have to say probably a strong criteria as well around emission units and how they're used. But when then the political bits come in, you have to realize that, you know, the obligation here when it first came in was only to offset above 2020 levels. There've been some revisions since then, but that was the initial vision. That was signed in a spirit of compromise, going back to that point about some states wanted to go further, some slower. We had a lot of reviews that were promised every 3 years, and I think states thought that having got the agreement in place, they would use those reviews to come back to some of the important issues that there wasn't time for initially, really sort of delve into those and try and move that forward, and that just really hasn't happened. And it just feels that while all this has been going on, the debate has really moved on from offsets. I think, you know, there's a lot of discussion amongst the public. They're confused by it, different standards, voluntary markets, regulatory standards. And I think airlines in general have moved away from offsetting as a way of decarbonising to more towards the in-sector reductions. But, you know, it takes time for ICAO and its policies to move through. And perhaps going back to this non-binding point, these are ICAO's long-term aspirational goals. So that's the LTAG, long-term aspirational goal. And this is my highlighting, but I just wanted to sort of pull out some of the words. You know, states are encouraged, states should strive to achieve, you know, a collective aspirational goal. You know, recognize the different circumstances of countries and their ability to make it. So what it's really saying is, while there's a global vision for the industry, it's very much down to individual states about how they contribute towards that goal. So I think the question mark really comes out of this process is this really ICAO that's driving it, or is it really the amount of effort that individual states put into it? And I would suggest that it's very much the latter, that it requires state ambition, and all the time that state ambition is having to be negotiated with other states that perhaps don't share that vision. And so you get something that does bring the world forward, but it does it on a very, if you like, lowest common denominator approach. It's not really, in the opinion of the environmental organizations, the vehicle that's going to sort of really get to grips with the decarbonisation challenge and move this forward. So if I think then about the case for regional action, this is a map that shows contrails around the world. There are more up-to-date maps. This one just happens to be from 2015, but I don't think the up-to-date maps would show you a different geographical balance. But here's a good case perhaps where you don't need ICAO. Do you really need a global approach to tackle things like contrails, when the science tells us that you have probably 80% of the contrail energy that we're trying to reduce coming from only a few percentage points of flights? And they're really sort of concentrated in geographical areas. So Europe, North America, North Atlantic, that seems to be predominantly where a lot of contrails are forming. And, you know, you only really have five countries that control North Atlantic airspace, sort of the UK for the Northeast, Portugal for the sort of Southeast, and then the US and Canada, respectively, for the Southwest and the Northwest, and Iceland sort of doing the polar regions. You know, an agreement between those 5 states in terms of how to manage contrails, look at things like contrail avoidance, seems to me a much more fast-track approach to getting actual real reductions in terms of aviation's impact on climate than perhaps working through ICAO. So there's a good case for regional action. And then looking at the individual state actions and what states are doing, you know, probably I think the last time I looked, 40 or 50 countries have sort of net zero sort of policies in place for their aviation sectors. This one happens to come from the UK. So this is the Jet Zero strategy that came out about 2 years ago. Probably looks very familiar. Global industry roadmaps, other countries' roadmaps, all show very similar things. So there's a wedge here of emission reductions that are likely to come from alternative fuels. The yellow bar shows a sort of slow transition towards zero emission aircraft, so electric and hydrogen propulsion coming through. And you know, there are efficiency improvements in here as well. And this seems to be a really sort of common vision that I say most decarbonisation pathways share. The percentage points may vary in each case, But the ambition and the general direction all shows the sort of in-sector reductions, cleaner fuels, cleaner technologies coming through. But I think question I wanted to sort of leave you with is whether the impression of action actually lives up. As I say, it's a strategy, it's not a policy. So in order to realize all of those things on the previous page, you need to have policies to implement them. You can't just draw a line and say, we think alternative fuels will sort of come in the 2030s and scale up in the 2040s and just assume that the market will drive it. You really have to push policies to deliver that. And we're beginning to see that a little bit in Europe with the sustainable fuels mandates that are coming through for the UK and for Europe. And if you look internationally, you've got the IRA in the US that's creating similar incentives. But there are still big policy tensions just because the UK set a vision. There's a big debate at the moment about, okay, you've told us we're going to have sort of 2% sustainable aviation fuels in the short term. But what does that look like in 5 years' time as we sort of scale up towards the sort of higher percentage points? And who pays for it? Who's paying for decarbonisation? And that's a real central policy tension that we don't have answers to. And so this is a piece of work that we commissioned from Element Energy. They're a consultancy that the government uses a lot in the UK. So we actually thought that we would invite them to scrutinize the Jet Zero strategy that you saw on the previous page. And I think they were really looking at risk. So it's one thing to set a vision, but with high costs, a really strong emphasis on being able to scale in the 40s that we don't have much sort of reality for at the moment. Some of the economic pressures facing the industry. Element Energy's sort of assessment of all of those policy things is that there's a real high risk or a medium risk that these policies just aren't going to deliver in the timescales that we envisage. And so with that in mind, we come back to this question about, is policy asking the real questions? Is it really just in-sector reductions? Or do we need to do something more than that to really force the sort of pace of change? And we have, I think, quite a limited discussion when it comes to alternatives. I'm going to come back to renewables in a minute, but I think we have we do have a UK climate change committee. They're statutory advisors to government on all things related to decarbonisation. And they've made a similar assessment to the one that I've just shown you. And they also see the risks of non-delivery are really high. And rather than wait to the sort of 2040s and find that we've missed our targets, they think there's a strong argument for big changes to the way that we actually use air travel. So they're not actually recommending degrowth. It's not about going backwards in the UK, but they are recommending slowing down the rate of growth for air travel in the UK. So they say we should be aiming for no more than 25% increase in passenger growth compared to 2018 levels. The government's figures are closer to 50%. The industry's figures are closer to 75% between 2018 and 2050. So they're saying you really need to slow down and actually to change the narrative. So if the industry decarbonizes quicker than expected, then of course we can actually relax some of those restrictions. We can go faster. But they say the emphasis should be on the industry reducing first before we actually release those brakes, rather than at the moment continuing to grow and hoping that we can find those solutions. This is going to be a really pressing argument for our new government. They've got two big airport expansions on the agenda that have been going through public hearings this year. And in early 2025, they're going to have to give decisions on whether London Luton and London Gatwick get their expansion in the context of this advice from the committee. And so this is shaping up to be one of the really big first test of this government in terms of where it sits on environmental credentials. I'm just going to go back very briefly to say, if you look at this map, there is an area under the curve here. It's about 15 million tons of CO2 in the UK in jet zero. Some recent revisions make that more like 18, 19 million tons. But what do we do about this? The in-sector reductions alone don't get us to net zero. And so we have to concentrate on how we actually deal with the residual emissions. And I think the big debate that's happening in ICAO, and it's certainly happening at a state and regional level in Europe, is removals. So I'm not talking about offsets. I'm talking about engineered removals, things like direct air capture. I think the environmental NGOs more generally are less favorable towards using nature-based solutions. But this engineered removals seem to be the way that we're going. Can we scale them? They're still very expensive. It's got all the problems that come with sort of scaling up SAF and scaling up technology as well. So that's why I put the removals in there, and it's part of this sort of recognition from the committee that we need to confine and constrain our growth until some of these things are more proven. And I'm just going to end finally with, I suppose, a little bit about messaging around greenwashing. Because here the law seems to be changing. There seems to be a sort of a battle developing between, on the one hand, having demand management measures, on the other hand, having in-sector reductions. Clearly, the industry favours the latter, not the former. And so it's really keen to tell the general public and politicians that things are happening and are moving in the right direction. And sometimes that goes too far. And, this is a KLM ad that's on here that talks about flying responsibly and talks about its use of sustainable aviation fuels. And this was successfully challenged in the European courts recently as being not honest, I suppose. Not reflecting the true nature of the problem, that words like sustainable need definition. They imply that things are good today, that the public can have a clear conscience, and that simply isn't the reality, that everything that we do today is still very much dependent on kerosene and its associated emissions. So I think a sort of warning really that everything that's happening is being carefully scrutinized, that the environmental NGOs in particular are keen to pick up on the messaging, pick up on the claims that are being made, really try and unpick them. And so we have an honest debate. And that's been a whirlwind tour. I think I've had my 20 minutes, Tim, so I'm going to hand back to you. But I think there are lots of things we haven't touched on, like emissions trading systems and things like that. We can drop in the chat. And we certainly delve into more detail and questions in some of these things. But the very briefest of tours, I think, about where we are on environmental regulation and how it appears to offer a sense of direction. But actually, the reality is that many of the policies that we need just simply aren't in place today, and that there should be real alarm bells ringing in terms of pushing politicians and pushing the industry to do more. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, very much. That was very interesting. I think it will raise hopefully quite a few questions from our audience. So just a quick reminder to those in the audience to any questions that you've got for Tim, or that it's kind of perked some questions for you, please put them in the Q&A. Tim will start to answer them if he can whilst we hear the other presentations, and then we'll take some of them into the open Q&A at the end. But very interesting presentations, some key things there around policy and regulation, what we can expect perhaps to see in the future or not. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, who's from Griffith University. Please welcome Professor Ivan Diaz-Rainey, who is currently in the UK. So I want to thank Ivan for getting up so early to be with us. And I'm just going to give a quick bio. But Professor Ivan Diaz-Rainey is a professor of finance at Griffith University. He's a leading international expert in climate and sustainable finance, and his research expertise includes climate finance, carbon markets, energy finance, banking, financial regulation, green fintech, and energy and environmental policy. So Ivan will now present about the finance and investment aspects of the transition to a low carbon future for aviation. So over to you, Ivan, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. So I've titled this Sustainable Finance, Shareholder Pressure and Climate Governance. I think my presentation is very complementary to Tim's discussion. I think a lot of the issues that he brought out come out in my presentation, but I guess I add another layer, which is this shareholder pressure. So Tim spoke a lot about government and the need for government action, which I completely acknowledge. But the way I see it, the influences on climate policy have evolved over recent years. So of course, governments, NGOs, the COP processes play an incredibly important role. But there was a sort of well-known article in Nature Climate Change, which it was entitled "Investors Take Over Climate Action." And so I think in 2015 in the Paris Agreement, there was a framework called the TCFD framework, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that was implemented. Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England at the time, and Michael Bloomberg, who obviously set up Bloomberg and was mayor of New York, and President Macron were particularly influential. And so from my perspective, there was a sort of evolution where all of a sudden investors who had been interested in climate issues become increasingly interested, and a framework is created. Now, more recently, what I would say is, and there was across sectors, and I should point out, I'm not an aviation expert, so I'm really a climate finance, climate governance specialist. So you have this evolution from sort of governments really driving governments, and the IPCC process and the UNCCC process of driving climate action, to investors becoming an important player. And this TCFD framework eventually was rolled into IFRS. And so these are international accounting standards. So, essentially what's happening is the accountants are taking over. And so this means that in particularly listed firms, but it's not just listed firms, have to start to report their climate risks in a sort of TCFD framework, which has been rolled into this thing called IFRS S2. And so rather than it being voluntary disclosures, they're as FRS S2 and S1 are implemented globally, they become mandatory. So this is evolution from sort of voluntary disclosures about climate risk and climate impacts to mandatory. And this also builds on the fact that we have a growing number of institutional investors. So there's this thing called the UNPRI, United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, that under which investors make a commitment to consider environmental and social governance issues when investing. So the vast majority of assets under management globally are aligned to UNPRI. So in principle, about 120 trillion of 145 trillion assets under management should be considering environmental issues when making investment decisions. So this is my way of saying, the investors in the sector should be taking note of the environmental footprint of the sector, of any sector, right? But and unsurprisingly, perhaps their initial focus has been on let's say the oil and gas majors and energy utilities, less so on aviation, and I'll show you some data on that in a second. There is, however, concerns that some of this ESG integration into investment decisions is light, and to follow up on Tim's comments, there is a lot of concern on greenwashing. So, you know, we've seen it in Australia. Investors have been pulled up on greenwashing. So a couple of firms have been fined by ASICs in Australia. But this police raid in Germany that happened to Deutsche Bank and DWS over greenwashing in investments means that you know, it was a momentous occurrence, because it was, you know, it suggested that rather than just being a civil potential issue, it could ultimately become a criminal issue. I think it was unusual, right? And I think most of the pressure that's going to come from investors and to investors to stop greenwashing will not have criminal implications, but there's certainly got a lot of notice. This is from the Financial Times. It was on the front of the Financial Times. But this is to say, greenwashing is a big focus of regulators globally, which puts pressure on investors, which then puts pressure on the companies they invest in. And by the way, this is not just potentially listed firms, so listed airlines. Any firm that borrows money will also face these pressures, whether it's through the bond markets, whether it's through loans. The pressure is coming. So as I said, in 2015, Mark Carney came up with the TCFD, or Mark Carney Bloomberg framework. Before that, he had come up with his classification of climate risks as physical risk, transition risk, and liability risk. I think I don't really need to explain what physical risk is. It's highly intuitive. You know, we have natural disasters and that affect firms. And so this framework is how will investors be affected by climate change? So obviously natural disasters could destroy assets. Airports are often located close to the sea and subject to flooding, as we've seen in Dubai not that long ago. And you know, if you land near Auckland, you know, so many airports where you land, you see the sea very close, and it's subject to sea level rise. But clearly in the airline industry, and echoing what Tim was saying, transition risk is really important, right? So you know, how can the sector be decarbonized? And the other risk that Carney outlined is stakeholder pressure, shareholder resolutions, and litigation. And so, you know, I've discussed a little bit about physical risk. As I said, I'm not an aviation expert, but I was interested in preparation for this presentation to sort of start to look at some of the physical risks that might affect the industry: air turbulence, coastal flooding due to sea level rise or extreme seas, heat stress to workforce, reduced payloads, and actually one that often people don't really think about related to climate change is climate change related conflicts leading to obviously wars, and therefore the closure of airspaces. We've seen that recently in the past week or so as the Middle East has the conflict has intensified there. I'm not saying that particular conflict is related to climate change, but the more doomsayers on the consequences of climate change predict increased conflict, and therefore if you have conflict, then you are going to have flight disruption and flight paths interrupted. You know, a lot of people claim the Syrian conflict is a climate change related conflict because it started after a number of repeated droughts. But of course, for aviation, really the key here is this transition risk, right? And from an investor perspective, it's put into the hard to abate sector. And I was looking at some of these abatement scenarios, and I was curious to see where the vision is in terms of where where the reductions might come. And so again, I suspect the audience know more about that, but obviously a big emphasis on sustainable aviation fuels, and you know, a much smaller emphasis on demand change. But again, that echoes Tim's point. So, you know, if we're going to avoid a large demand change, then we will need to make sure that SAF scales up in the required time. And then there's liability risk, ESG or climate shareholder pressure. And so, as I intimated earlier, a lot of the pressure from shareholders, NGOs, like this really interesting firm called Client Earth, who are global and go around engaging with firms, encouraging them to transition. They have what they call an escalation ladder. So they will start to engage with companies privately and potentially publicly through press releases. Then they may ask questions at annual general meetings. Then they may, try to vote down directors if they feel the company's not doing enough. And then at the next level, they step up to filing shareholder resolutions. And ultimately, if none of that fails, then there'll be shareholder litigation. And so the point here being is, so far, and as I'll show in the next couple of slides, there hasn't been too much emphasis on aviation from these firms. The focus has been, as I mentioned, on energy utilities, on oil and gas firms, steel, and so on. But I'm seeing an increased number of shareholder resolutions. So what I'm saying is this pressure's coming. This pressure's coming. There has been this perception that aviation's a hard to abate sector, but as energy transition is happening in other sectors, then their focus is going to move on to those other sectors that have been historically seen as hard to abate, but they need to be addressed, right? Agriculture would be another good example, which has so far got off lightly. So we did some research related to these shareholder resolutions, and there's also been a evolution in their nature. So early on, the nature of these resolutions was, please disclose your greenhouse gas emissions. And often firms were reasonably happy to comply with those requests. But what has happened in more recent years is that the nature of those shareholder resolutions has changed, and we call them, they're operation related. I'm not sure if this is the best term, but really what they mean is they're more strategic. They're asking, how does your business strategy align to Paris goals and staying well below 2 degrees of warming? So this is a fundamentally different question to please disclose your scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. It really takes you to strategy and how you actually transition in the industry. This is a very quick bit I did. So this comes from CERES, which is an NGO that collates shareholder resolutions. And as you'll see, they've only been of some 2,700 shareholder resolutions that CERES has tracked by investors. Just 13 have come to the aviation, but there's been an uptick in recent years. And note that really this isn't just NGOs actually, or individuals filing these shareholder resolutions. You are now getting serious institutional investors filing these resolutions. BNP Paribas Asset Management, which manage a huge amount, 400 billion. So these are serious investors that have gone from, this would be nice to have some nice words around climate governance, to them seeing it as a real investment risk, right? So the risk from their perspective is they make an investment in the industry, and then there's all of a sudden strong government regulation that perhaps would limit demand in some way. This is the TCFD IFRS framework, really, which starts with governance, goes on to strategy, risk management, and metrics. It's quite a detailed framework. A lot of you will be familiar with it. So it does raise really interesting questions. You can download the IFRS framework and so on. I think how companies respond to implementing this stuff. Again, I've seen an evolution. Many firms treating it initially as a compliance exercise, and then the penny starts to drop, that it's more about compliance and it really is about strategy and governance. And to really get to that point, they really need to build knowledge, capacity, and capability. And also there's an emphasis on it not just being about risk, but also opportunity. So early movers could have a potential business benefit from it. There are also questions of how do you structure your boards to really best deal with these issues. So does everybody become knowledgeable on this? Do you have a champion, and so on? So interesting questions for boards to deal with this. I presume most of you are familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol, and Scope 1 emissions really is anything that a company directly combusts, usually from energy. Scope 2 is purchased electricity, and Scope 3 is upstream and downstream. But clearly for aviation, and this comes from Persephone, Scope 1 emissions is really where most of the action is. There's some Scope 2 emissions for purchased electricity. And here they note that there is this transition from sort of voluntary to mandatory emissions, and what's driving that is IFRS. So to complement what Tim is saying, his focus is very much on governments, and that pressure should continue, and governments do need to coordinate, but this is additional pressure coming from investors. And now going to the next level, it's going into accounting standards, which has in many jurisdictions serious legal implications. If you have accounting disclosure around this stuff, it needs to be audited, and as I said, it comes with potential legal implications if it's misleading. In terms of we talked about metrics, the greenhouse gas protocol, and disclosing Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Another big thing has been net zero commitments, and again we've seen, I was interested to see how these have grown with it in aviation, but these two have been subject to a lot of criticism. So concerns around the ability to deliver these net zero commitments is very high. I was interested to see that Air New Zealand rode back on its 2040 commitment or 2030 commitment because of a lack of availability of more efficient aircraft and SAF. So it highlights that some of these net zero commitments are hard to achieve, and there's a concern that some of them that are far out are pushing action into later years. And of course, the issue that Tim mentioned on crediting and over-crediting of offsets is a huge concern amongst the academic community, which I think even if you think it becomes ultimately is overcome, then you've had this perception that it's just not going to work. Conscious of time, so I'll try and wrap up. Another very important regulatory development. So I've talked a lot about TCFD, and really that's largely or IFRS largely how environment will affect the companies. But in the fight against greenwashing, I think another major development is this green taxonomies or EU green taxonomy or common ground taxonomy. And really what this does is classify business activities as green or not green. And this is really a rule book that, so this dictionary that classifies activities as green or not, has been created in by the EU, by China. The common ground taxonomy is really largely an interaction between EU and China. And really, I think this is actually a very powerful tool, and in a sense is going to overtake things like, not overtake, but become very important in terms of understanding how green companies are. So it's part of the battle against greenwashing. And so really, rather than just defining what's green and what's not, in the EU context, it comes with disclosure requirements. So companies are going to have to disclose the percentage of revenues that are qualify as green, the percentage of CapEx. And again, I think this is really important for airlines and the airline sector. So capital expenditure, in other words, investment that is climate aligned, right? So these disclosures, I don't recall exactly when they start, but already data vendors are trying to estimate these for companies. So I think that the green taxonomies, and in particular with the associated disclosures, are going to become quite painful for firms that are not moving rapidly enough. So yeah, really to summarize, really companies should not treat this as IFRS as a sort of compliance exercise. It's being implemented into accounting standards, so this is going to come with a whole related legal weight and scrutiny related to disclosures that firms are going to make. Net zero commitments have been under incredible scrutiny, and there's a concern about them. And I think really what's coming ahead is really the EU taxonomy, or common ground taxonomy, is going to provide a magnifying lens to be able to see, so that investors can see and regulators can see how green companies truly are. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ivan. And just like Tim, you've kept it pretty much on time. So that's great. So it was great to learn more about the climate finance risks and opportunities in aviation. I've seen there's been some questions in the Q&A for Tim, and he's responded to some of them. So if you have questions for Ivan, do post them in the Q&A. And Ivan, feel free to start answering them in that Q&A box there for you. I'm delighted to invite the final speaker today, coming to us from New Zealand, Pete Sutherland, who's from the Civil Aviation Authority there in New Zealand. In terms of his biography, Pete has 26 years aviation experience, primarily as an engineering officer with the Royal New Zealand Air Force, where he worked on the creation of the New Zealand Defence Force Airworthiness Regulation. He's currently managing CAA New Zealand's project for ensuring New Zealand's aviation regulatory system is prepared for the entry into service of New Zealand's first commercial electric airplane operation in 2026. Pete will focus on the decarbonisation technologies in the future of aviation. So the floor is yours, Peter, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks for the intro, Tim. Just so people are aware, I won't be on camera there. I'm currently on vacation in a location which is short on Wi-Fi bandwidth. So to save bandwidth, I'll just be speaking to the slides. But yeah, thanks, Tim. Can we have the next slide, please, Chantal? So these here are just some images of the future technologies that we see as providing a pathway to the decarbonisation of aviation in the future. Looking at them in general terms, we've got things that are going to contribute to efficiency gains, typically being advanced aero engines. The unfortunate thing with them, though, is that they're subject to the laws of diminishing returns. Thermal efficiency gains can be made by improving turbine materials, and propulsive efficiencies can be gained by high bypass ratios, but they're also limited by fan size, weight, and drag penalties. We've got reduction of drag technologies with aircraft with high aspect ratio wings. That means it's got a slender chord versus length ratio. We've got non-tube and wing designs, such as the blended wing body, those concepts have been around since the 1950s, and they're probably complex compared to tube and wing designs, and nothing has been no commercial viable design has been taken through to certification yet. We've also got sustainable aviation fuel, which has already been mentioned several times. So that's a drop-in fuel, which probably offers the most immediate potential for significant carbon reductions. Relatively speaking, it's not too complex. 50% blends have already approved for use. The feasibility of 100% SAF has been demonstrated by Virgin Airlines in their Flight 100 test, and that resulted in 65% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions for a comparable flight using jet fuel. Governments worldwide have started or have been introducing SAF mandates to stimulate further demand. Unfortunately, New Zealand's progress along this path has stalled somewhat with the previous government walking away from a sustainable biofuel obligation, which was due to come into force in 2025. The major problem with SAF, obviously, though, is that everybody wants some, and there's not enough to go around. Looking at newer technologies, there's battery electric. While that technology is certifiable as it is, or very, very close to being certifiable, the limitations due to the power capacity of those batteries plus their weight means it's probably going to be limited to short sectors from a commercial feasibility. Probably the one of the technologies that offers the most promise is high power density superconducting electric motors powered by cryogenic hydrogen fuel cells. Technically complex, but potential high benefits. Those probably though aren't going to be in the arena for certification though for a good decade plus yet. So any of these new technologies present regulatory challenges for an aviation safety regulator such as CAA New Zealand or others worldwide. One of the major questions we look at is will the new technology fit into the existing aviation system? And if not, what is it then that we need to do? Next slide, please, Chantel. Sorry, I think you might have missed one. That's it. So new technologies, they require regulators to consider the impact across the entire breadth of the aviation system. And looking at any of those new technologies that were on the slide previously, the general areas that are listed there would probably be affected in more than one way by any of those new technologies. When assessing them, the questions that need to be asked, particularly at the start in terms of initial certification, focus on what is it that new technology might be capable of, what are its fundamental characteristics, how does it perform at a component level and or a system level. Also though, just importantly, is what is it not capable of, what are its failure modes. Could use or operation of that new technology in the aviation environment impact or compromise the fundamental characteristics of that technology? What risks does the failure of that present to itself, and how could these risks interact with wider aircraft systems? What can be done to prevent or mitigate those risks and the failure modes? And do the current rules allow the use or application of the new technology, or a new airworthiness criteria and guidance material needed to ensure that the new technology can be safely integrated into aircraft designs? Go to the next slide, please, Chantel. What we've got here is an example of what was new technology at the time being introduced into the Boeing 787. It's a rechargeable lithium-ion battery. So the image on the left is what the battery should look like in its normal state. And the two images in the middle show a battery which, after certification and entry into service, there were two battery failures in close proximity to each other. One was an APU battery, or auxiliary power unit battery, and the other one was the main aircraft battery. Boeing had chosen to use the lithium-ion battery as a because of the need for a higher, larger amount of electrical power on the Boeing 787 compared to previous models. They chose lithium ion because of its high energy density and its low comparable weight. The battery was certified using what was then state-of-the-art airworthiness or safety criteria, which required the battery to preclude the occurrence of self-sustaining uncontrolled increases in temperature or pressure. Those failures obviously showed that whilst the airworthiness criteria may have been correct, the way with which the design was shown to comply with those criteria may not have been as good, or was not as good as what it could have been. So the FAA, who was the certifying authority for the 787, subsequently updated the requirements needed in relation to airworthiness criteria, as well as standards used to demonstrate compliance to that criteria. And those updates were done several times, to the point where the current installation on the 787 is what is on the right-hand side. And so the main and APU batteries now exist in what's called more commonly referred to as a coffin, with a stainless steel enclosure which vents overboard in the case of a battery failure, and prevents there being the risk of fire spreading throughout the aircraft. Now, interestingly, in terms of energy density, the 787 batteries have an energy density of 80 watt-hours per kilogram. Now, in comparison to what's being certified currently, that's extremely low, or is low. FAA are currently looking to certify a propulsion battery, or the first propulsion battery that has had certification applied to it, and that is a battery with a 200 watt-hour per kilogram energy density. And recently, a manufacturer, Magnix, announced that they were looking to develop another propulsion battery with a 300 watt-hour per kilogram energy density. So these are it shows, I guess, the growth in energy density levels of lithium-ion batteries that's happened in the last dozen years, and which has potential to increase as we move forward. Next slide, please, Chantel. So beyond looking at the initial certification requirements for aircraft systems and designs, there's also the challenge of whether a regulatory system is capable of enabling a new technology to operate within it. And examples, the example that I've got there on the right there, which is the AEST 609. So that's a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. It's been designed in the late 90s, early 2000s, and has yet to achieve certification. It's been obviously in the last 5 to 10 years that other technologies and around electric propulsion systems have enabled a more widespread application of VTOL technologies to become a potential possibility. And so now the question is, could a hybrid VTOL potentially fit into the existing aviation system, or what would need to change to enable that to occur? And so looking at that particular aircraft, the 609 or any other sort of VTOL, it operates in what could be considered a helicopter mode when it's conducting takeoffs and landings. It operates in what could be considered an airplane mode when it's in level cruise flight. And so it's quite probable that there are existing rules that apply, but it's also quite probable that there are rules which are not applicable or need adjustment to reflect what that new technology is. Now, if you were to use that example again and say, right, how would we train a pilot, or how would we expect a pilot to be trained for an aircraft of that nature? Again, is a pilot required to be have a certain experience on an aeroplane, or is a pilot required to have certain experience on a helicopter, or is there a need to have both? Or is it that there is sufficient to be trained by the manufacturer in just that operation of that aircraft alone? So it's these sorts of questions that regulators will be asking themselves when presented with a new technology of that nature. Next slide, please. So one of the other considerations for regulators worldwide these days is about compliance-based rules versus risk-based or performance-based rules. In recent years, there's been a shift in aviation regulators away from compliance-based rules towards a risk-based or performance-based rule framework. New Zealand itself only has a couple of rules at this time, which are risk or performance-based. Typically, under a compliance-based rule regime, an applicant or aviation participant is required to show they comply with explicit requirements for a rule. An example I'll throw out here would be an aerodrome operator has to carry or have available a specific amount of fire extinguishing agent that can be discharged at specific rates. And those amounts and discharge rates have been based on the maximum length of the aircraft and the diameter of the fuselage that operates into and out of that aerodrome on a regular basis. And those extinguishing agents are all designed to deal with petroleum-based fires. Now, under risk-based rules, excuse me, more onus is placed on an applicant or participant to identify risks applicable to their operation and their technology that they either operate or are exposed to in the nature of their business, and then to implement appropriate mitigations for those risks. So using that the example of an aerodrome operator again, an electrically powered aircraft operating into and out of an aerodrome, sorry. Under the New Zealand regulations, the aerodrome operator is required to have a certified safety management system, and the deployment of that system should identify new hazards and their associated risks as they arise. So a new aircraft type operating into an aerodrome that's powered by a lithium-ion propulsion battery presents significantly different fire hazards than those presented by a liquid petroleum-fueled aircraft. And under a risk-based approach, the regulator focuses on the participants' application of their SMS and identifying the applicable risks associated with that new technology and the mitigation applied to them, rather than the need to specify specific compliance-based requirements. Excuse me. Now, what this does is this approach enables new technology to be introduced while ensuring that regulated participants are aware of and responsible for the risks associated with the technology that they operate. This approach is also has also identified a need for regulators to consider different ways of conducting business, and dealing with individuals, organisations in the new technology space. Next slide, please, Chantel. So what we have here is a slide that shows a model that CAA New Zealand has adopted for when dealing with what we call emerging technology participants or organisations who come to us wanting to introduce new or emerging technologies into the aviation system. Historically, these newcomers would be dealt with using what I would call the standard regulatory approach. They would apply to the regulator for a certain approval, and in doing so, be required to demonstrate compliance with established compliance-based regulations. Now, the standard regulatory approach is challenging enough for those participants who are already in the aviation system, let alone those with little or no previous experience with that system. New technology applicants tend to be new to the aviation system and aviation industry, and dealing with them using that standard approach was found to be unsuitable. And so what CIA has done is it has stood up the Emerging Technologies Unit, and what this unit does is it sits on one side of a Chinese wall or an ethics wall to that of the regulatory staff who actually make the certification or safety decisions. The ETU engages with innovators as they when they approach CIA for guidance, and what they do then is deal with them in a pre-application state until their technology has become either certifiable or near certifiable, at which time they're then handed off to the regulators and dealt with via what is more akin to the standard approach. What this requires is a very high degree of collaboration between CIA and the participants who and the applicants. It requires projects that might be complex to be managed using formal project management philosophies, which aren't necessarily used throughout CIA for other more standard applications. And what allows the ETU to do is not be constrained by existing processes that are in place. The feedback that we've received so far on this approach has been positive, and the relationship between the ETU and the emerging technology applicants is been found to be excuse me, it's found to be well received and entirely different from their experience that they may have previously had under the standard approach. The next slide, please, Chantel. What we have here, which is my final slide, is an example of a participant that the Emerging Technologies Unit is currently dealing with. So Air New Zealand have made the decision to purchase a fully electric aircraft that you can see here, the Beta CX300, which is undergoing certification by the FAA in the United States. Air New Zealand recognise the need for airlines to advocate for new technology, which will then stimulate development and eventually adoption by large-scale manufacturers. The aircraft has been purchased by Air New Zealand not to be a huge commercial success, but to be used as a catalyst of change and an opportunity to increase knowledge both within within Air New Zealand, CAA, and the wider aviation system in New Zealand, which will be needed to advance the introduction of alternate propulsion technologies in the medium to long-term future. The information that they gain, they will use to inform their procurement decisions in and around replacement aircraft for their turboprop fleet, which at this stage are scheduled to be replaced in the 2030s. And despite being a large participant, despite being the largest participant in the New Zealand aviation system, this particular interaction with Air New Zealand is being dealt with through the Emerging Technologies Unit in the way that I've previously described. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Very insightful to hear a little bit from the regulators in terms of your perspective, and also really great to hear about this new collaborative approach and trying to help enable which is really great. And I wanted to thank our audience as well for posting questions, and our speakers who have been rapidly responding as well in there, which is really good. So for those of you that haven't seen some of the responses to the questions raised, please look in the Q&A and continue to post questions. That's really great. Please continue. So on that note, I'm going to ask the speakers to join us now for the Q&A panel. So if everybody could put their cameras on, Pete, perhaps we can even try with you and turn it off if it doesn't work, but just so people can see you there in the panel for the Q&A. And we're basically going to start now with some questions, and I might hand over to Tim just to start that process with the first question to the panel,
Yeah, sure.
even if it's targeted at someone initially. Yeah,
just thanks again to all the speakers, right on time and great details, and thanks Ivan and Tim for answering those detailed questions in the Q&A. So I think with this a lot of them are quite detailed, so I'm trying to keep the questions kind of general that you can kind of all answer. I sense that with the greenwashing and the kind of coming out of Germany, or the financial information, Ivan, coming out of the US, that you have places where these greenwashing finances start. Any thoughts on what kind of triggers or thresholds to really spread it more further, or where you see it moving forward? And I'll probably go round the order. So Tim and then Ivan. So Tim, how do you see those things spreading, like the greenwashing one that you put up for Germany, kind of globally or around Europe and beyond?
I think that.
I'll start with Tim and then come into Ivan. Sorry.
I'll be really brief. So I think this is a great one for Ivan. But I think most of these actions started with civil society action. I think it's civil society that put pressure on companies, and I think you get two reactions. You get one, the court cases, and they obviously lead to legal decisions, but I think, you pressurize regulators into thinking, okay, we need to bring some clarity to the market. We need rules and regulations to create the certainty, because I think that's what it's about. I think it's in the corporate world, you in order to make claims, you need the certainty that they're going to be accepted by the public, by shareholders, by wider stakeholders. And I think you put pressure on regulators to fill that void where there are gaps. But I do believe it's in many cases it does start with civil society action. But Ivan, maybe you have a different view.
Yeah, go for it.
Look, I think it started with civil society, and then investors became interested in it. But I think, as I intimated in my presentation, once the stuff gets put into accounting standards, and again, accounting standards have different implications in different jurisdictions, but they usually come with quite serious implications, potentially implications for directors, right? Legal liability for directors and so on. So I think civil society will continue to be the main driver, but I think there is an evolution where, once you start reporting stuff, not just in a separate sustainability disclosure, which, doesn't have the legal implications that it does in your annual report. So this is where they talk about integrated reporting, right? So, we're used to looking at the income statement and the balance sheet, and that's audited, and if that's misleading, there's serious implications. Well, integrated reporting, and I'm starting to see it, is not just the financial numbers. There's these environmental disclosures, and they're in the same report with the same sort of legal implications. So I think you're going to see a lot more financial regulators, accounting regulators intervening in the space.
From your perspective, Pete, in New Zealand, in the CAA, in terms of the changes infiltrating your kind of sphere, where do you see it coming from internationally, and which other CAA equivalents do you link with in Australia or internationally?
Yeah, look, the CAA has strong links in and around to TEQSA in Australia. We are engaged with them with a particular VTOL project at the moment, or we are starting to engage with them on a VTOL project a local air ambulance operator has put money down for a VTOL aircraft, which is being designed and manufactured in Australia, and that will be at this stage the first aircraft of that nature to come into New Zealand. We're also engaged with FAA. The FAA in the States are the major, you might say, FAA and the AEST are the two major regulators in the world that a lot of other civil aviation authorities look to in terms of setting requirements, setting guidance material, as well as ICAO, obviously, as Tim mentioned. ICAO, they're a UN agency. They were, you might say, the first UN agency, I believe, to be established. They provide material which is agreed to or not by participating countries, and again, as Tim mentioned, those need to be those requirements from ICAO need to be approved by a country through legislation. But yeah, so it's quite an interwoven web of regulators around the world, traditionally led by FAA and the AEST.
Okay, I've got a question, and this is one that hasn't been answered yet, but is in our Q&A. So it's a question around kind of emerging fuels, alternative fuels, and emerging technologies, such as hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels. But how do we kind of assess the trade-offs between those emerging options and the potential impact on aviation infrastructure and ecosystem dynamics, particularly thinking about life cycle emissions and economic feasibility? So we might go in the same order. So Tim, and then Ivan, and then Pete again, just your reflections on that in terms of moving forward.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma. If you take it at a general level, it's a really sort of frustrating process, I think, because I think, everyone would probably say, one of those pathways can deliver something. It's not going to deliver everything. So we need to keep the focus broad. But it does feel at the moment that we have really narrow bandwidth. We sort of suffer a little bit from short-termism. So the things that we can do now, like drop in alternative fuels, get all the attention. It's something that, we can actually see the plants developing worldwide. And so from an industry point of view, you put all your efforts into that because it's a story you can tell now. And things like hydrogen and electro, which are a longer term evolution, really struggle to get bandwidth. They struggle to get investment. They struggle to get the policy attention. It's quite a small world out there, actually. In terms of the decarbonisation debate, lots of actors, but in terms of the policy side that drives this, you're talking about, several people within each airline or airport contributing to this discussion, some civil society groups and wider sort of stakeholder groups, but it's quite a small policy world with a limited bandwidth. And ICAO only ever meets every 3 years, for example, when all its states come together. It's not like the COP process that meets annually. So, people tend to focus on what they can do immediately. So I don't have an answer. I think we need to do all those things. But that's easy to say. The reality is really hard to deliver. As I say, what energy is out there at the moment seems to be focused almost entirely around the SAF market.
Look, really interesting. So I think investors will call that the tragedy of the horizon, right? Or Mark Carney came up with this term, the tragedy of the horizon, that investors and so on are quite short-term focused. I'm not an expert on the technologies, but I'm fascinated by it. And Tim's comments sort of concern me in as much as, I believe he's right? And I think there's an analogous situation that sort of threatened to happen in the energy sector more generally, with the emphasis on everything hydrogen, and that's clearly not played out. So if something similar might happen in SAF, then it would be very concerning, because then the sector has limited pathways, shall we say. So yeah, look, in terms of the various sectors, some of them I would say the pathway is increasingly clear. So energy generation, the pathway is clearly renewables, with light vehicle transport fleet. Clearly EVs have in my opinion, run that race. But I guess one of the reasons why investors haven't placed that much pressure on the aviation industry so far is because the solution perhaps is not obvious right yet. So there's this sort of technological uncertainty still. And I don't think investors will necessarily fill that gap. There is a strong need for public policy, the R&D side, so public policy supporting the R&D side. Yeah.
Thanks, Ivan. Pete, do you have anything to add?
I'll just agree with what both with both what Tim and Ivan have said. We need to take a wide approach. Each of those technologies that I showed in that first or second slide of mine will contribute something in varying degrees, and none of them are the final solution, so to speak, but they are all going to contribute. And you're right that what's in the here and now, and especially from a political perspective, what's actually going to get me elected next time round seems to be the most important decision that's made, rather than necessarily what's going to be good for aviation and the environment in 10, 20, 30 years' time.
Yeah, good point. There's one question in there, which a detailed contrast one, which Tim, if you could have a look. I'm also conscious of time. We do kind of finish quite prompt at 4:30 time here in Australia, so we've got about 8 minutes, and I'll close it on the time. So I think I've got time for one more question to go around, and I quite like the quote from Pete's presentation when he said rulemaking is a lengthy and resource-intensive process, which we kind of all agree with, and can be frustrating. In a safe way, are there any ways of kind of in your sphere speeding it up? So I'll go around with Pete first this time. Anyway, speeding up the rulemaking in your regulation, and then I'll do Ivan with rulemaking in terms of the business and the corporate world of speeding up that, and then kind of Tim's mentioned about ICAO and the work, the sphere that he's in. Any way you can see of speeding up bureaucracy and rulemaking. So Pete, you put the quote. You want to say something on that?
That's fine. That's fine. Happy to take that one, and quite timely actually, because very recently, in the last couple of weeks, the minister who we're responsible to, or the Emerging Technologies Unit is responsible to, issued some guidance that we are to, or CAA is to, create a new rule to enable emerging technology participants into the system to conduct research and development activities in a much potentially freer manner than what they currently do. Now, that guidance was issued that we're to have this rule created and in place by the end of next year. Now, that's a real challenge, and as I say, the normal process is probably a 3 to 5 year process. Now, the political urgency for that will obviously stimulate work, but it diverts effort off other current work that is happening. I think the biggest thing that I see a regulator trying to do is to create rules that are agnostic of technology, agnostic of particular aspects of aviation technology, to enable them to have a longer life, and enable new technologies to come in behind them without having to need to evolve those rules as technology evolves, as has been the case in the past.
Yeah, no, good, interesting perspective. And Ivan, in terms of the kind of rules and bureaucracies around kind of business and finance, any ways you could see that being sped up properly and appropriately, obviously?
I think the climate is going to take care of that, unfortunately. As the news gets worse, and then, sorry, it's a rather grim prediction. I mean, I think on the positive side, we're getting energy transition in certain parts of the light vehicle fleet, as I mentioned, energy generation. But as the new, so the energy transition news, I think is going to be good. The climate news is going to be terrible. And, I don't think there's upside there from the climate scientists I follow. I think that will put a lot of pressure on governments to, those that haven't implemented IFRS S1, S2 domestically, that all of a sudden there'll be a push. I mean, there's good academic evidence that shows whenever there's big events like storms and so on, and people sort of suddenly start to understand the consequences of what we're doing to the planet, and suddenly there is a greater emphasis on implementing these things. So I don't think there is a magic bullet. I think there is a quiet transition that a lot of people are unaware that, the financial sector and the accounting sector are moving in this direction. And I do think it will be quite a powerful tool. It won't be a smooth process, but there will be increased emphasis on ensuring companies disclose their related risks and their impacts on climate.
Yeah, definitely good response. Thanks. Tim, you got anything to add up? You've been typing away on the question at the same time, and I think anything to add there. Thanks.
Two very brief points, I think. One, from an ICAO point of view, I mentioned it had an aspirational 2050 goal. There were some illustrative scenarios developed that suggested to states how they could get there, but there is no definitive pathway from ICAO. So where's the benchmark? Where are the interim targets? How can we measure progress? How do you know whether you're on track, whether you need to be doing more? That seems to be something that would really speed things up at ICAO if we were able to readily benchmark what's there. And I think the other one is take the brakes off. If some states want to go faster, let them go. Because I think, ICAO, as I say, it wants to move as a unit, and quite often we actually spend a lot of time and energy confronting states that want to go faster, trying to bring them back in line, and so I think the combination of those two things would help enormously.
Yeah, I like that idea. Before I close, Emma, have you got anything to add?
No, just thanks everyone, the speakers and the audience, some great questions. There was one comment there I might just flag because I think it's insightful, but thanks Mark for the comment and plea for us also to think about air freight in our work and not just passengers, and thanks Tim for doing a quick response there. But they could have specific economic, technology and operational options and issues that are worth considering and are different to passenger aviation. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, that was a really good point actually. I try and bring that in mind, but I've probably been as guilty as others of kind of not emphasizing it as much. So yeah, we'll make sure that we cover that a bit more. So look, thanks again to the three speakers. Appreciate the Violet had to get up really earlier. They're on holiday, so a special thanks for that, and all the presentation have certainly added something extra to the challenges. Gone away with lots of thoughts and ideas, so particularly thanks. Feel free to watch it again, any of you. In terms of joining us next week, so we've got 3 weeks of Aviation Reimagined. So next week it's managing future environmental impacts in the air, on the ground. So particularly on the environment side, particularly on the science side. So we hope you can join us next week. Thank you very much, and feel free to reach out if you have any comments. And we look forward to seeing many of you next week. Thank you very much, and watch out the socials and the web pages. Have a good week. Thank you.